My name is Nix Calder. I'm 34 years old. Last Wednesday, while the rain was pouring outside, my phone exploded with 39 voicemails from the toxic family I hadn't spoken to in 8 years. No, I'm sorry. No, I miss you. Just desperate voices begging the daughter they spent years breaking. It was the kind of rain that doesn't ask permission. It arrived sometime after 10 at night. And I remember the sound of it hitting my window like a second heartbeat, steady, insistent, filling every quiet corner of my apartment. I had been sitting on the couch with a book open across my lap, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the side table, and the particular kind of peace that you only understand if you've spent years learning how to build it from scratch. The lamp beside me threw a warm circle of light. The rest of the room was dim. I was, by every ordinary measure, fine. My phone was face down on the cushion beside me. That was a habit I'd developed early in my no-contact years. Face down. Always. So the glow of the screen couldn't interrupt the stillness I was still learning to trust. I had friends who texted late. A coworker in a different time zone who sometimes sent links to articles she thought I'd enjoy. Nothing that couldn't wait until morning. Nothing that ever made the phone shudder with that particular kind of urgency. When it started vibrating, I thought it was a mistake. A pocket dial from someone I knew. Maybe? Or a string of news alerts from an app I'd forgotten to silence. I didn't pick it up immediately. I turned a page. I took a sip of tea that had already gone lukewarm. Outside, the rain thickened, and somewhere down on the street below, a car alarm went off and then cut out just as suddenly. The phone stopped, I exhaled, then it started again. This time I reached for it without thinking. The way you reach for something that's become a reflex, not with intention, but with a kind of automatic response that lives below conscious thought. I turned it over. The screen was bright with a notification I hadn't seen in 8 years, a name I had buried so deliberately that seeing it again felt less like reading and more like being struck. My hands didn't shake. I want to be clear about that. I had done enough work on myself that my hands did not shake. But something deeper than my hands, something that doesn't have a name in any language I know, lurched sideways. One voicemail. That was what the screen said at first. Then, in the time it took me to blink, it changed. 3, 7. The phone continued to vibrate in soft, rhythmic pulses. And the number kept climbing, the way water rises in a room with no drain, slowly enough that you keep thinking it will stop, quickly enough that by the time you understand what's happening, it's already too late to step back from it. 12, 19, 26, I sat completely still. The rain outside grew louder, or maybe I only noticed it more. The way you notice silence after something shatters it. 39 voicemails. From a number I had blocked on every platform, every channel, every pathway I could think of. Except, it turned out, this one. The number had changed. Of course it had. 8 years is long enough to change a phone number, long enough to find a new angle of approach. Long enough to plan something that looks like desperation, but might be something else entirely. Or maybe it really was desperation. That was the thing about Celia Calder. She had spent my entire childhood making it impossible for me to tell the difference between what was real and what was performance. Even after 8 years of distance, even with all the work I had done, I was not immune to that particular uncertainty. I set the phone down on the cushion, face up this time. I looked at the ceiling. The water stain near the light fixture that I kept meaning to report to my landlord was still there, shaped vaguely like a country I couldn't name. The rain pressed against the glass. My tea was cold. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been 20 minutes ago. And yet something had shifted in the atmosphere, the way pressure shifts before a storm fully breaks. A heaviness that settles in the body before the mind has caught up to what it means. 39 voicemails. My mother, my aunts, my brother. A chorus of voices from a life I had walked away from so quietly and so completely that some days I almost managed to forget I'd ever been part of it. They had found a way through. And now, in the dim warmth of an apartment that was entirely mine, that contained not one object, not one photograph, not one trace of who I had been before I chose myself. They were waiting for me to press play. I didn't. Not yet. I pulled the blanket from the back of the couch, across my lap. I watched the rain blur the city lights beyond the glass into something soft and unrecognizable. I breathed in, and then out. And then in again, a practice my therapist had given me years ago for exactly the kinds of moments when the past decides it isn't finished with you. And I thought about who I was now. About the 8 years of silence that had not been emptiness but architecture. About how much it had cost me to build the life I was sitting inside of, and about whether I owed anything at all to the voices waiting in that phone. I thought about all of that for a long time. And then, finally, I pressed play. If this is already hitting close to home, make sure you're subscribed. This story is just getting started. People always want to know what no contact looks like from the inside. They imagine it as a wound that never closes. A door you stand in front of every morning, wondering if today's the day you'll open it. I understand why they think that. From the outside, cutting off your entire family sounds like an act of violence. Something ragged and bleeding. Something that must hurt in a way that never fully heals. What they don't understand is that for some of us, the wound was already there. The no contact wasn't the injury, it was the bandage. My apartment is on the 4th floor of a building in Portland, Oregon. It faces east, which means that on mornings when the sky cooperates, the first light comes in at an angle that turns everything it touches briefly golden. The edge of the kitchen counter, the spines of the books on the shelf, the small ceramic mug I keep near the window with dried lavender in it because I read once that lavender is calming and I was, at 26 years old, desperate enough to try anything. That lavender has been there for years now. I stopped needing it to be calming a long time ago. Now it's just something I love. That distinction matters more than it might sound. I work as a technical illustrator for an environmental consulting firm. It is not the most dramatic profession, and I say that without apology. I spend my days translating complex ecological data into visual language, maps, diagrams, cross-sections of watersheds and soil compositions, illustrations of root systems and erosion patterns. There is a precision to it that I find deeply satisfying. The work requires me to look carefully at things and then render them clearly, without distortion, without editorializing. I became very good at my job. I think I became good at it, in part, because I spent my childhood learning to read rooms to observe without being observed, to understand what was really happening beneath the surface of things. That skill, taken out of the context where it was forged, turned out to be genuinely useful. I have a small circle of people I trust completely. My friend Dara, who I met at a pottery class 7 years ago, and who has never once asked me why I don't talk about my family, only listened when I finally chose to tell her. My neighbor Ezra, who is 71 years old and leaves homemade soup outside my door whenever he makes a large batch, and who refers to me, without irony, as the quiet one, as though this is a compliment, which, from him, it is. My therapist, Dr. Usai, who I've seen every 2 weeks for 6 years, and who helped me understand that the stories we inherit from our families are not sentences. That we can put them down. That choosing not to carry them is not abandonment. It is survival. These are the people who make up my world. It is small by some measures and immense by others. There is no drama in it, no unpredictability, no sense that the ground might shift beneath me without warning. When I first built this life, I used to feel guilty about how quiet it was. I had been conditioned to believe that love was supposed to feel urgent and chaotic, that relationships were supposed to require constant management, constant appeasement. Stillness felt suspicious to me for a long time. Peace felt like something I had stolen rather than earned. It took years to understand that what I had called love, growing up, was not love at all. It was leverage. Before I go any further, I want to pause for just a moment and ask, if you're watching this from somewhere that feels like the life I just described, somewhere you built from nothing after leaving something behind, will you drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from? There are people in this comment section who need to know they're not alone. I'll say it again at the end, but right now, in this moment, you being here matters. The no contact decision did not happen in a single dramatic moment. I want to be honest about that, because the stories we tell about these choices tend to flatten them into something clean and decisive. One conversation, one final straw, one door slamming shut. The reality was quieter and took much longer. It was a slow accumulation of understanding. The way sediment builds at the bottom of a river, individually imperceptible, collectively transformative. I spent 2 years before the final silence talking to therapists. Reading, writing in journals, I later burned not out of drama, but out of a genuine desire to stop reviewing the evidence. I already knew what the evidence said. What I can tell you is this. On the morning I went no contact, I was 26 years old and I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the apartment. I had just signed a lease on the first apartment that was entirely mine, that no one in my family knew the address of. I had a coffee, I had a notebook. I wrote down, in the plainest language I could manage, what my life had looked like for the previous 26 years. And then I wrote down what I wanted it to look like for the next 26. The 2 lists shared almost nothing. That clarity, arriving that quietly over a cup of coffee on an ordinary Tuesday morning, was the most important thing that has ever happened to me. 8 years later, I know who I am without them. I know how I take my coffee and what kind of light I like to work in and which books I return to when the world feels heavy and what my laugh sounds like when nothing is being performed. I know the sound of my own breathing in a room that is safe. These are not small things. To someone who has never had to learn them from scratch, they might sound ordinary. To me, they are everything. They are the entire architecture of a self that was built on the other side of a silence that saved my life. And then, on a Wednesday night in November, while the rain came down in sheets against my east-facing window, 39 voicemails arrived, and every single one of them was from the people I had left behind to become her. Memory is not a filing cabinet. I used to wish it were something organized, labeled, retrievable on demand, and closable when no longer needed. Instead, it operates more like weather. It arrives uninvited. It changes the temperature of the room you're standing in. And sometimes, when the conditions are exactly right, a certain quality of rain, a voice you haven't heard in 8 years playing through a phone speaker in a dim apartment, it rolls in all at once, and there is nothing to do but let it move through you. The first thing I remember about Celia Calder is her hands. Not her face, not her voice, her hands. The way they moved when she was making a point, precise and deliberate, cutting the air in front of her as though she were editing something invisible. I must have been 4 or 5 years old the first time I noticed it, standing in the kitchen doorway in a nightgown that was slightly too small for me, watching her explain something to my father in that low, controlled tone she used when she wanted to make clear that she was not angry. She was simply correct. Her hands moved like punctuation, like periods placed at the end of sentences that were not open for discussion. Stellan Calder was a tall man who took up very little space. I have thought about that contradiction many times over the years, and I still find it remarkable. How someone so physically present could be so thoroughly absent. He worked long hours, which was the explanation offered whenever I was old enough to ask questions. And for a long time I accepted it because children accept what they're given when the alternative is nothing. But absence, I learned eventually, is also a choice. Every evening he came home, ate the dinner Celia had made with the silent efficiency of someone completing a transaction, and retreated behind whatever barrier he had constructed between himself and the rest of us. He was not cruel in any active sense. His cruelty was the cruelty of omission, the consistent, deliberate choice to look away from what was happening to his daughter in the home he helped build. Reed was 3 years older than me and had, from an early age, an instinct for alignment. He understood, before I had the language for it, that in our family there was power and there was powerlessness, and he chose his side early and maintained it with a consistency that I might have admired in a different context. He was never overtly unkind to me. That would have been too obvious, too traceable. What he did instead was more sophisticated. He filed information away. And at the precise moments when it would benefit him most, he would surface something I had said or done or felt, reframed just slightly, and offer it to Celia like a gift. He was 11 years old the first time I understood what he was doing. I was 8. I had told him, in confidence, that I was afraid of Celia when she got quiet, that her silence scared me more than her words. 2 days later, during a dinner table conversation, I no longer remember the subject of, he mentioned, casually, that I had said I wasn't afraid of anything. Celia's eyes moved to me, and Reed looked down at his plate with the calm expression of someone who has just made a very clean move. Ingrid and Sable were Celia's sisters, and they were, in the way that certain supporting characters are, essential to the architecture of her authority. They appeared at holidays and birthdays and the occasional Sunday, and they brought with them a kind of choral reinforcement that Celia seemed to breathe in like oxygen. They validated her version of every story. They nodded at the right moments. They directed their warmth at me in ways that felt conditional, affectionate when I was performing well within the family narrative, subtly cool when I wasn't. As a child, I thought I was imagining it. As an adult, I understand that it was one of the most consistent forms of communication I ever received from them. Your belonging here is contingent. Never forget that. The controlling, in Celia's case, was never loud. That is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you about her, and the reason it took me so long to name what had happened to me. Loud control is legible. Loud control leaves marks that other people can see. What Celia practiced was something quieter and more durable, a management of perception, of possibility, of the stories I was allowed to tell about myself. When I did well in school, the achievement was attributed to her investment in my education. When I struggled, it was evidence of a flaw she was graciously trying to correct. My emotions were either performances to be managed or inconveniences to be minimized. My friendships were evaluated for what they said about the family's reputation. My body, my clothes, my voice, my preferences, all of it existed within a frame she had built and maintained with the patient dedication of someone who understood that the most effective cages are the ones the occupant doesn't recognize as cages. I was 19 the first time I told someone outside the family what my childhood had felt like. A college roommate. During a late night in our dorm room when the conversation had wandered somewhere real, I used careful language. I minimized instinctively, softened edges, added qualifiers, preemptively defended Celia against accusations I hadn't even made yet. My roommate listened, and when I finished, she said something I've never forgotten. You apologize for her more than she probably ever apologized to you. I laughed it off. I went home for winter break 3 weeks later and didn't think about that conversation again for 2 years. The rupture, when it finally came, was not a confrontation. I need to say that clearly because I think people expect a scene, raised voices, a reckoning, some exchange of truths that clears the air. There was none of that. There was a phone call, the week of my 26th birthday, during which Celia said something so precise and so revealing about the way she saw me, not as a person, but as an extension of herself that had malfunctioned, that I felt, for the first time, completely clear. Not hurt, not angry, clear. Like a fog I had lived inside of my entire life had lifted all at once, and I could see exactly how far it stretched in every direction. I said very little. I let her finish. I said I needed to go, and I hung up. 2 weeks later, I signed the lease on the apartment with the east-facing window. I told no one in my family the address. I changed my primary phone number. I blocked every channel I could think of. And I began, slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of therapy and a great deal of lavender that I didn't yet believe in. The long work of learning who I was when no one was managing me. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was also, without question, the most necessary. The rain outside my apartment window didn't know any of this history. It just kept falling, indifferent and clean, while 39 voicemails waited on my phone like a verdict I hadn't asked for. The first voicemail began before I was ready. I pressed play with the cautious detachment of someone opening an envelope they already know contains bad news. Not curiosity. Not fear, just weary inevitability. The voice that filled the room was instantly recognizable, even after 8 years. Celia Calder didn't need time to reintroduce herself. Her tone carried the same practiced calm she used to weaponize empathy, that soft, deliberate cadence that once made strangers think she was the kind of woman you could trust with a secret. I knew better. Nix, she said, the syllable drawn out, almost tender. I know it's been a while. You've made your point, but this has gone too far. There was no tremor in her voice, no apology hiding in the pause. It was a statement, not a plea. She spoke as if the 8 years had been an act I was performing for her benefit, an indulgent gesture she had allowed to go on a little too long. When the voicemail clicked to an end, the screen jumped immediately to the next. The second message was shorter. You need to call me back. This isn't about the past. Her emphasis on the word past was surgical. That was how she always controlled the story, by pretending that time rendered truth irrelevant. It was what she did best. The third one came seconds after. Reed's trying to fix this. But we need you. We need you. Not, we miss you. Not, we're sorry. Just need. The shift was deliberate. In my family, need had always been the currency of control. The people who needed least were safest. I paused the playback. The rain had changed tempo outside, softer now, as if nature itself had stepped back to listen. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of the pipes in the wall, ordinary sounds that had carried me through years of peace. I wanted to keep living inside them. But curiosity, or maybe closure, nudged me forward. I pressed play again. The fourth message wasn't from Celia. It was Ingrid, her voice breathy and insistent, heavier with performance than any theater production I'd ever seen. Nix, honey, it's not what you think. Everyone's under stress. Your poor mother hasn't slept in days. I could hear Sable murmuring agreement in the background, her voice tinny through the recording. Then Ingrid added in that sugary tone that adults reserve for children they want to manipulate. You know, she only ever wanted the best for you. I felt something deep in my body coil. That sentence had been the lullaby of my entire childhood, the justification for every boundary crossed, every wound left unexplained. The next few messages blurred together, Celia's commanding calm giving way to clipped frustration, then back to levity, like a metronome, keeping time with her shifting intentions. In one, she was stern. Ignoring family doesn't make you healed. Nix, it makes you cruel. In another, performatively gentle, you must be so lonely without us. Then there was one from Reed the first time. I'd heard my brother's voice since our last terse exchange the night I left. His tone was smooth, calculated. Nixie, he said, using the nickname only he had ever gotten away with. We need to talk. It's not just about Mom. Things have changed. The pause that followed was exact, long enough to imply seriousness, short enough not to reveal emotion. He'd always perfected timing like that. When Reed's message ended, I stared at the phone for a long time before pressing play again. I didn't recognize the voice that followed it first. Sable, this time murmuring between sobs that felt mechanical, punctuating every sentence with Celia's name. She's not well, Sable said. Please, Nix, whatever happened before, just call her. The word please did something strange inside me. Not because I believed it, but because there was a time when hearing anyone beg for my attention had made me feel needed. The kind of needed that temporarily filled the spaces left by affection withheld. I had spent years in therapy unlearning that reflex. It wasn't love. It was conditioning. Something in the messages shifted around the 12th one. The tone tightened. Less pleading, more demanding. Celia's calm began to crack around the edges, exposing something raw. You don't understand what's happening, Nix. You owe us a callback, she said, her breath sharp enough to make the sentence sound more like a warning than a request. Then Ingrid again, whispering like she was afraid to be overheard. It's serious. They might lose the house. She hasn't told anyone everything yet. The house. That old, gray structure on the corner of Hearth Avenue, the place I'd promised myself never to step inside again. If the house was in danger, it meant there were debts. Debts meant instability. And instability was Celia's most potent stage. It was the environment in which she performed best, orchestrating sympathy, rearranging truth, rewriting herself into a new role. She'd always call it crisis when what she meant was control slipping. I listened to 15, maybe 16 messages like that, a carousel of tones and tactics, a rotating cast of wounded voices performing the same request in a dozen different costumes. And somewhere between message 17 and 18, I realized what this night was becoming. Not a reunion, not an emergency. It was bait. Carefully layered, emotionally precise bait. By the 23rd message, my tea was long gone, my shoulders rigid from stillness. Outside, the rain relented into mist. I looked at the phone like it was an old photograph, something that once documented pain, but now only described distance. I didn't delete the messages. Not yet. Part of me wanted to hear all of them, to see what shape the story took when the performance ran out of script. And deep down, another part, the child who had once flinched at the weight of her mother's silence, wanted confirmation that Celia had not changed at all. So I rewound to where I'd left off, pressed play, and Celia's voice slid through the speaker one more time, brittle and breathless. "Then maybe," she said, "you'll regret not calling when you still could." There was one message left. By the time I reached the 24th message, the performance had changed genre completely. Celia's tone had lost its veneer of polite despair. What remained was something taut, almost electric. Rage spoken through clenched restraint. "So, that's it," she said. 8 years of silence, and now you get to sit there, pretending we don't exist." I didn't answer. Of course, she wasn't speaking to me. Not really. Celia had always spoken to the mere version of me she'd built in her mind. This version didn't bleed, didn't panic, didn't resist. It obeyed her need to be blameless. The recordings had started to sound like psychological weather bursts of thunder. Stretches of calm, the air tightening right before the next storm cell arrived. Ingrid's next message was deceptively soft, full of sighs and half-finished sentences. "She just wants closure, Nix. You're her daughter." Then, quieter, "She's getting older, sweetie." That was a new tactic. Mortality, the one theme Celia had previously avoided because it didn't fit the image of control she cultivated. But desperation had a way of eroding even her strictest choreography. Reed's next message was colder than his first. "If you don't call back tonight, you'll regret it." Just that. No context. No inflection. He'd always known exactly how to dangle fear without giving away the truth beneath it. The threat wasn't physical, and it wasn't even necessarily emotional, it was structural. Reed had learned from Celia that power lives in ambiguity. When you leave a sentence unfinished, the other person will fill it with their worst fear. I used to be predictable that way. Not anymore. The 20th-something messages blurred together. Celia's voice rising, breaking, recovering. Ingrid's whispers growing hoarse, Sable's sobs dissolving into static. And through all of it, a rhythm emerged, a familial symphony of panic designed to lure me back into the old choreography. Fear, guilt, duty, hope, guilt again. I recognized every movement of the score. The difference was, I no longer danced to it. I realized, then, that what they wanted wasn't me. It was access. To my phone, to my attention, to the old power dynamic that had kept them coherent. Without my participation, their hierarchy unraveled. I was no longer the scapegoat, the vessel that carried their tensions away from one another. I remembered something Dr. Osei said years earlier during a session I nearly missed. Systems don't collapse quietly. When you stop engaging, they get louder before they disappear. The messages were the loud disappearance, I hoped, would come next. But then came message 31, and it was different. Celia again, though the confidence had thinned to something brittle. "It's about your father," she said. "He's sick. It's bad this time. Really bad." The silence that followed stretched longer than the 3-minute mark. Her voicemails usually cut off at 4 seconds. She didn't breathe into the receiver. And in that space between her inhale and exhale, I heard something that wasn't manipulation. It was exhaustion. Still, every instinct told me to doubt it. Celia's exhaustion was often just a pivot, a calculated moment of weakness meant to evoke guilt. But what if she wasn't lying this time? What if Stellan was sick? I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and let the question hang there, heavy as humidity. The logical part of me whispered that I had no responsibility to find out. The part that still flinched when I heard Celia's name, whispered Mom in old memories, didn't stay silent. I turned the kettle on just to have noise in the room. Boiling water, a sound I could trust. By the 35th message, she had shifted again, returning to accusation. "Is this what makes you feel powerful? Ignoring the people who gave you everything." The irony twisted like glass in my chest. Everything. What a word to use. They had given me silence, self-doubt, and an allergy to my own emotions. I built healing on the ruins of that gift. Yet, somehow, hearing her claim generosity in the same tone she once used to justify cruelty still scraped old nerves raw. The 36th message arrived 30 seconds later. It was read again, this time colder. "You should know, Mom signed the house over last month," he said. "Don't ask me what she's planning, but if she does something, it'll be on you." I could nearly see him standing there, holding his phone a half arm's length from his chest, positioning himself at a perfect balance point between detachment and threat. Reed never lied outright. He simply let half-truths create the illusion of reality. Whatever the situation was, it wasn't about Stellan's health. It was about property, leverage, survival. When the 37th message came, it wasn't words that caught my breath. It was the sound. Celia's intake of air before speaking, ragged, uneven. "Reed doesn't understand the whole story," she said, slower now, words slurring slightly. "It's not about the house. It's about the choice I made. About what I didn't tell you." Then, abruptly, the recording ended, cut off mid-sentence as if she'd hung up or lost signal. My pulse quickened. For someone who had made control her religion, losing narrative mid-thought was sacrilege. Whatever came next would be either confession or collapse. Outside, thunder rolled, distant but close enough to vibrate the glass. I sat back down, phone still in hand, low light spilling across my knees, feeling like the air itself had thickened. The messages were at 38. One left. Before I pressed play, I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but from the recognition that something irreversible was coming. I didn't know if Celia's next words would be another manipulation, or the truth she'd kept buried beneath decades of performance. But I knew this much. No matter how the night ended, there would be no going back. Not to them. Not to the version of myself they once broke. Before we enter, what happened next? Tell me something. If you've ever reached a message you weren't sure you wanted to hear, where were you when it found you? Drop a comment below. Not for me, but for the others watching who've stood at this same doorway. I turned the volume up, the rain outside fading into a steady whisper. There was one message left. The phone screen glowed faintly in the dark, the way a candle does just before it dies. 38 unheard voices behind me, one left ahead. I hesitated for a few seconds. That felt longer than the 8 years separating now from everything before. Then I pressed play. "Nix," Celia said. Her voice was lower than I had ever heard it, rough at the edges, stripped of its careful modulation, rain still falling outside my window, static still filling the silences between her breaths. Yet, somehow the sound that reached me felt naked in a way nothing from her ever had. "It's late," she began, and then stopped, as if realizing that time had stopped mattering somewhere between dusk and whatever hour she was in. "You'll never hear this one," she murmured, almost to herself. "But I have to talk into something. Silence feels too heavy tonight." I didn't move. I didn't blink. She wasn't performing. That fact was so alien that my body didn't know how to process it. Celia was never even her cries years ago had been orchestrated, pauses, crescendos, theatrical gasps at moments designed to fold pity into control. But now, there was no stage. No audience, no applause waiting at the end. Just her, in whatever room she was sitting in, and the faint, uneven rhythm of her breath carrying through a hostile kind of night. "You think I didn't know what I was doing?" she said then, voice gaining enough steadiness to sound almost conversational. But I did. I knew. The words emerged like stones heavy enough to bruise. "Every time I told you that you were overreacting, every time I reminded you how much you owed me, I knew exactly what those words did to you. People like to believe cruelty sneaks up on them, that they become controlling because they're afraid, or they push too hard because they love too much. That's not true. Sometimes, you just choose it." The line of static hissed louder, breaking the sentence before the end. I wished, absurdly, for a longer pause, some barrier between what I'd already heard and whatever came next. But the recording resumed, smaller now, like her voice had turned away from the phone. "You were supposed to be strong for me," she whispered. "Not against me. But when you left, I saw something that night. You looked free. And I thought that was supposed to be my freedom too. I built everything so carefully. Nix, the rules, the silences, the image. But none of it held without you." A dry laugh followed, not cruel, just hollow. "Reed thinks this is about the house. He's wrong. It's about me realizing there's nothing left to hold on to. I found myself standing. I couldn't remember when I'd moved, only that I was near the window, hand resting against the cool glass. Outside, the rain had eased into mist. The city lights were faint reflections like the glow inside the phone, blurred and trembling. Celia took a breath, long and uneven. "I don't want forgiveness," she said. "I wouldn't know what to do with it. I just need someone to know that I didn't lose control by accident." The soft grind of her chair moved through the recording. A click, maybe a lighter or a ring brushing glass. "Your father always thought silence was peace," she said, voice fading. "I thought silence was power. But you," her breath trembled. "You're the only one who used it to escape." Another pause, the kind of pause that feels eternal even when it's just a heartbeat. "I won't call again," she said finally. No flourish, no manipulation, just an ending. The message cut off there, mid-static. My phone screen went dark. For a long time, I didn't do anything. I stayed by the window, one hand still on the glass, the other still holding the phone like it weighed more than it should. I replayed her final line in my head, but it didn't feel like closure. It didn't even feel like revelation. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement that truth, even when small, can end lifetimes. Eventually, my reflection in the glass caught my eye, the faint outline of someone who had once belonged completely. To Celia Calder's architecture of guilt, but now stood apart from it, unmoved. I realized that this was the first confession she had ever given me. Not out of love, not out of remorse, just truth, unclothed and unadorned. The kind that keeps you awake, not because it hurts, but because it finally fits. I turned off the phone screen and let the room fall silent again. No voicemail could follow this. No further performance was possible. The night itself seemed to exhale. I sank into the couch, closed my eyes, and felt the last echo of her voice fade under the steady hush of rain. Stillness, that was all that was left. The stillness she taught me to fear, now mine, finally, to keep. By the time I opened my eyes again, the rain had stopped. The silence that followed a storm always had a particular texture. Clean, open, a kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from me. Light crept through the blinds in long, soft lines, turning the room gold at the edges. My teacup was still there on the table, cold and untouched. The surface smooth enough to mirror the glow of the window. Time hadn't really moved, not in any meaningful way. I was still exactly where I'd been when the 39th message ended, except something inside the air had changed. It wasn't grief. I'd grieved this family years ago, in ways they would never have recognized as grief. It was something gentler and clearer, a recognition the truth my mother confessed wasn't news to me. I had always known. Every dismissive smile, every manipulative sentence, every moment she rewrote reality to better suit her story, I'd known what it meant, even when I didn't yet have the words to name it. But hearing her finally say it aloud, even after 8 years, gave the silence I'd built its final contour. Not a wall, a boundary. The city outside was waking up. Brakes hissed down on the street below, and someone's dog barked in the courtyard. I sat on the couch, scrolling back to my mother's contact. Not to listen again, but to see the number one last time. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. What I felt was the weight of choice. Because silence is not passive. It's an action you repeat, day after day, until it becomes a language. And I was finally fluent. Before doing anything else, I stepped onto the balcony. The damp air kissed my skin, carrying that faint petrichor smell that always reminded me of possibility. Birds were beginning to thread their song through the spaces the storm had emptied. The world looked rearranged but calm, as if nothing. And everything, it happened overnight. It struck me that this was what peace actually felt like. Not the absence of noise, but a freedom from interpretation. I went back inside, sat down, opened my phone. My thumb hovered over the list of unheard messages, all with that small triangular icon waiting for me to press play again. But I didn't. Instead, I selected them all at once. My screen blinked, a quiet confirmation tone followed, and the messages disappeared, erased. Not out of denial, but out of reverence for the life they no longer belonged to. Then, one last thing. I opened the text message field, the cursor blinking beneath her name. I typed 2 words. I know. No anger, no flourish, no explanation. Just truth, as small and heavy as a stone. I pressed send, watched the tiny checkmark appear, and then blocked the number. It felt like lowering a curtain after a long, strange performance, the audience gone. The stage empty, the lights still warm. If you've ever reached that kind of silence, the clear, echoing moment after choosing yourself, where were you when it happened? Let me know below. Someone else might need that map. I put my phone face down again, the same way I always did. The window light had stretched farther across the floor now, reaching my feet. For the first time in hours, maybe years, I allowed myself a small laugh. Not defiance, gratitude. The kind that comes from seeing something through to its very end. Somewhere, I imagined, my mother would listen to that final message Bubble deliver, read the 2 words, and tilt her head in that same way she always did when she realized she had lost control of the narrative. But this time, no one would correct her version of events. My silence did that for me. I turned on the kettle, not for tea, but for ritual, and waited for the first whistle. The sound filled the room like morning itself returning. It was, in every way that mattered, the sound of beginning again. This story did not write itself. Behind every word you just heard, there was a human presence. Someone who chose these sentences carefully, who sat with this pain long enough to shape it into something you could feel. You were never just watching a story. You were being seen.